Hello and welcome to Retech, and today we're going to continue with our little foray into the different kinds of architecture that were around and are currently around since kind of the early 1980s, and that's the open and closed architecture. And there's two different types. There's the hardware side, which we discussed last time, and the software side, which is what we're going to try and discuss now. So let's do a quick recap. Okay, we covered mainly the Apple systems against the open architecture of the PC last time, and we discussed the differences in hardware, and it also covering the differences within hardware between machines such as the BBC Micro and maybe an Apple Mac Classic or an Apple Macintosh. And what we discussed was the fact that the Apple Mac, even on its hardware side, was fairly closed. It was literally meant to be a closed system, whereas the BBC, although predominantly off-the-shelf parts and not really one for having slots like a PC or the original Apple II and the original Apple computers, it had more options for expansion and for third-party hardware, etc., and more options for tinkering, where the closed and very closed Apple Macintosh really didn't have a lot of options for the user themselves. So it was literally an out-of-the-box piece of hardware, and you got what you bought and you used what you bought. That was basically it. Now the software side of it's very different. It's got a very, very similar kind of mantra behind it with being closed architecture, or rather the Apple systems have. Now it was a bit of a leap from the architecture of the Apple II, where you were encouraged to expand it, encouraged to add on what you wanted it to do, whereas the Macintosh wasn't. It was literally an out-of-the-box experience. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So you see that the operating system on the original Apple Macintosh was very good, because it was kind of a take on what Xerox did a few years earlier. Now, what we needed was a little bit more of a more powerful machine than the Apple Macintosh or even the Lisa really was, because to run the GUI and all of its programming and all of its code to make it look as slick as it did, it really needed something a lot more powerful to make it work properly, because the Apple Macintosh as it stood didn't really have enough memory, didn't really have enough power to shove everything around on the screen the way that really users wanted it to. So if you compared a program running under DOS and a program running under a GUI such as the one used on the original Apple Macintosh, you'd find that it was relatively slower. And if you then got hold of an Atari ST emulating an Apple Macintosh, you'd find that the ST would run things a lot better than the original Mac using its own software could. So, you know, the hardware side of it really wasn't good enough. But every machine apart from a PC running Windows, had its own proprietary closed off system. Now, whether it was closed off on purpose or not is kind of a different matter, but if you think, Apple wanted to keep control. They wanted control of what the machines were being used for, what software were being put on the machines, what peripherals were being attached, and that was nothing new, because Atari did that decades before. Texas Instruments tried that a long time before. Now, if you look at the Texas Instrument machine, the TI-99, the TI-994, which it was originally released as, wasn't a bad machine, and it was not the commercial failure that some people would lead you to believe, because they sold quite a few. And then when it evolved into the 4A, it sold a lot of units. And the TI-994 and 4A were marketed as home computers, were predominantly closed in the terms that Texas Instruments wanted everybody to pay a license to have software run on that machine. They wanted control of what was being run. They wanted control of the hardware, control of the software, control of the cartridges. And that kind of intentionally or unintentionally made that a closed system. It wasn't easy to develop for, and it wasn't easy to publish on, simply because Texas wanted complete control over that. And that was probably a way of clawing back money, because the Texas Instruments TI-994A and 4 were a little bit ahead of their time, but they were very expensive machines to produce. Now that's what Apple was kind of getting at. They sold you a machine, quite an expensive machine, a machine that was relatively expensive to design and produce, and they wanted some kind of return on that, whether it was selling you Apple branded software or Apple approved software, or selling you Apple approved hardware. Now that's the difference between a closed and open system. Now the software on it, the actual operating system, was closed, but that was no different to an Amiga. The Amiga operating system was basically a closed system. You couldn't really run the Workbench, etc. on a different machine, different make, model, and so on. Same with the Atari. You couldn't use that operating system, although GEM, which is what it was based on, could have been used on a lot of other things, but the version that was used on the ST was not usable on the Amiga or a PC or any other machine. So the desktop was virtually closed, although Commodore and Atari didn't go down the route of Apple and Texas of closing off everything, so everything had to be approved, everything had to be licensed and authorized before anyone could produce any software, hardware or otherwise for the machines. Now there's the difference, but everything predominantly apart from the PCs, once the Apple II and IIe started fading away, was closed. Closed software, closed architecture, closed. Even your old 8-bit machines were fairly closed, because you couldn't go and run a software that was designed on a Commodore 64 onto a ZX Spectrum without a lot of conversions. So effectively they were proprietary and pretty well closed. Now most manufacturers didn't go down the route of closing their architecture to the point that you could only use X, Y and Z branded peripherals or X, Y and Z branded software. Now there's not a bad thing in doing that. It isn't inherently a bad thing. It gives you control of your product. It gives you control of how users perceive your product, and that's a big thing, but it kind of stifles, or could stifle, innovation, and it kind of could slow down progress, because you're the only ones producing software and hardware for a certain machine. Now the PC is an open architecture and an open software platform. Windows itself is an open system. It was designed that the user was also the administrator. It was designed that you could alter and change things on that operating system that you needed to suit you. It was designed to be multi-use, so anything with a x86 platform could run Windows. And that was the same for DOS. You see, it's always been a cross manufacturer's system, and that helps with innovation, and that helps with basically people trying and failing, or trying and succeeding in inventing new hardware and software for those machines, which is why the commercial and the desktop market became almost 100% at one point Windows. You know, Apple was flagging it was only a few percent, and Linux wasn't really on the board. And you know, you've got to realize that because hundreds of different manufacturers could build machines that could run Windows, well, Windows was always going to be the one that was the predominant force. And that operating system is still with us today. You got to think how old that OS originally was. Windows, the original version of Windows, Windows 3, 3.1.1 and so on, all the way up through to 95, 98, ME, Vista, XP and so on, all the way up to the modern release of 11. Now, does a closed software system or a closed system really matter today? Well, in the hardware stakes, not really, because you know, everything's proprietary really, to be honest, apart from the PC world. And take a mobile phone is a case in point. Basically, this is an all singing, all dancing current mobile phone. It is literally as powerful as a lot of desktop computers. It can do everything a desktop computer can do. In fact, it can do things faster than a lot of desktop computers. And it doesn't run a compatible x86 processor or motherboard or memory or anything. It runs on its own platform, which is Android in this case. But the actual device is closed. You can't open it up. You can't change much in it apart from a battery, or if you break the screen. You can't do an awful lot with the hardware. You literally can't do an awful lot with the software. It's designed on an ARM system to run Android. And the Android system isn't something you can go out generally and install. It comes pre-installed, it comes pre-set up, it comes with the latest version when the phone was released. It can be upgraded through its normal factory upgrades, which get pushed out every maybe 3-4 months or so, and it's always going to stay current that way. You don't have anything to do with that generally, and most people are happy with that. The phone just works. The apps just work. The apps are controlled because it's generally through one of the Android stores, and basically that is as much as you can do with it, and that's as much as you would probably want, because they are stable, they're reliable, and they work. It's not going to be long. Well, you can do it with this one. Plug in a keyboard, cast it to a screen, and you've got virtually a fully fledged PC that you can use, as in personal computer, that you can use for most of your things that you'd like to do with it. Browsing the web, doing your letters, typing up your spreadsheets, doing some video editing, some sound recording, some filming. You can do it all off of this little handheld pocket device, and that's where we're heading. We're not heading towards more desktop orientated machines. Proprietary. This phone is about 2 years old. Okay, so it's a generation down on the one you've just seen. Okay, it's Android. Again, it's updated with the latest version. Again, it's automatic updates. Again, it's been very reliable. It's never broken down. It's got an 8K camera on board, so as the other one. There's not really going to be much above that for a long time, and it can do just about everything you want. Again, you can use it as a desktop to run your games, to basically put anything you want on it and use it. You can do your word processing, your email, watch videos on it, use it as a everyday computer. That's 2 years old. It's proprietary, and again, it runs Android. Now, that's very much the same with what most people would see as a closed item, such as an iPhone. But an iPhone is no real difference to one of these. an iPhone doesn't have anything that would really put it into a league of its own compared to any of these. An iPhone won't be that alien to somebody going from Android across to an iPhone. And then if you're using iPhones, which are, are almost certainly closed, you will have no problem with jumping to a Mac. And a lot of people who use iPhones are still very wary of using Apple computers. They'd rather go for a Windows machine because in their minds it's more of an open platform. You can do more with them. Technically, yes, but in reality, what else do you need to do on a computer that you can't do on an iMac, an Android tablet or an Android computer? There's plenty of them out there now. A Linux computer, a Linux server. Now, they are very different in terms of software. They are very different in terms of operating system, but they will do predominantly the same things. And underneath it all, your basic Apple operating system is not far away from a Linux operating system. They are virtually built on the same foundations. So, in summary, there's no reason not to go for an iMac or an Apple computer. There's no reason in the classic world why you should avoid them, or the vintage computing world, because they are predominantly easier to get working out of the box than a vintage PC or a vintage laptop, and they are predominantly more stable, and they are predominantly easier to keep going on the software front. So again, there's not massive differences between open and closed platforms. We use more closed systems now than we ever have. Our tablets, our phones, the software on them, the software that's on your voice assistant, if you got one at home, such as Siri, Alexa, Google, whatever, whichever one you're using, they are proprietary, but they'll do the same things. They are closed systems, but they'll do what you want them to do. So don't be afraid to collect the odd vintage Apple if you really want to start collecting something slightly different from Windows machines. And remember that all of the classic 16-bit machines, barring PCs, were closed systems anyway, both operating system wise and hardware wise. The only difference was the mentality behind them and the ideology. So yeah, we just put up a Patreon page. Okay, it's don't massively expect to make a massive amount from it. It would be nice if something was forthcoming, if you like this channel enough, and it's all down to putting it back into this channel. So I would like to cover more on the people who are around now who actually developed, built, ran, installed, programmed all of the vintage machines that we've discussed, but I'd like to cover their stories in a very similar way to the David Pleasance one and Mark Isles stories that we've put out on this channel, and also the history and stories of places like the Leicester Computer Museum and what happened across the COVID period and so on. And we'd like to document these things, but again, it costs a lot of money, and it also means that it would be nice to get a tiny bit of help here and there, but that's completely up to you guys. This I do as a hobby, I do it for fun, and regardless, I'd still do what I plan on doing, but it might take longer. But thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Please subscribe. Thank you.